Good evening. It's quite late, so I will try to be short, but it's not my best skill set to be short, so I apologize. I come from big enterprise, so that's going to be my perspective on today's topic about AI, or specifically Gen AI. And very specifically, again, not about developing applications, but how Gen AI impacts you as developers. How many of you are developers here? Please raise your hand. So, about half maybe. How many of you have used GitHub Copilot? Okay, so good for you. For the people who are maybe wondering whether it is worth or, because you have to pay money for it, maybe your company doesn't want to pay for it because your manager is not convinced that it is worth. Actually, GitHub is owned by Microsoft, and Microsoft cares about money. So they didn't just, invest a lot of money and time into developing this product and without being sure that they can see some value from it. So what they did very early when the GitHub Copilot was, I think like a beta or something, they did a proper research on how does using this tool impact developer performance. And the way they did it, they recruited almost 100 developers and gave them a very simple task of writing a web server in JavaScript. And they gave them at the very start like 5 or 10 minute long video about how to use GitHub Copilot, what it is and how can it help. And then, in a very evil way, to the half of them, they didn't give GitHub Copilot access and said, well, now develop the old way. And to half of them, they did give this GitHub Copilot access. Before that, none of them have used it before. And so then they looked at the results, and 70–78% of both groups completed. The group that did not use GitHub Copilot took around 160 minutes to complete, and the group that did use GitHub Copilot used about 70 minutes to complete, so more than 2 times faster. Very impressive, very nice. Also, to the developers that I work with, the projects I work with, fully irrelevant. Nobody has these kinds of tasks, right? So it's kind of very questionable. Would it translate to big enterprise where people don't work with, the flavor of month JavaScript, where they have 10 years old Java code bases with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lines, where nobody can, do these kinds of fully greenfield projects. However, in this research, they also didn't just measure, the objective outcome. They also asked developers how did they feel about using this tool. And the results were, perceived productivity for the developers was they felt 88% felt that they were more productive. And there were also questions about how happy they felt, satisfied in general. Hey, less frustrated when coding, that's pretty good. A lot of people get frustrated at certain points. Actually, let's say, how many of you get frustrated when coding at least once a day? 1 person? Really? 2? Okay, very impressive. Anyway, so they also felt more fulfilled with job and felt like they could focus on more satisfying work. And also this part about efficiency and flow, like being in a flow state, they felt largely more in the flow, had faster ways to complete things, and had to do less time searching and spending more effort on repetitive tasks. So this looks pretty good, but it's self-reported, right? And also, again, this was for people who used it for maximum 2 hours. And on a greenfield projects, after seeing what the tool is for 5 minutes. We are interested in how would that work in real world with developers who did not volunteer to test it out, who work on these very old, large legacy code bases. And we have, in Baltics about 2,000 people or so. So we are very interested in seeing how can we leverage these kinds of tools. And we did a relatively small pilot project, also about 80 people, 80 developers. And we didn't give them new tasks. We didn't split them into groups because, they just have to continue working on their projects. So we couldn't really have a comparison like this. But we did have these 80 developers work for 2 months on their real tasks while using a GitHub Copilot. And at the start of the project, less than 10% of them have used and were using GitHub Copilot. At the end, more than 80% were using it. And when we looked at the results about their how they felt about their productivity and the tool itself, right? So this was the comparison. So these are the results from the GitHub volunteers with a fully new task, right? Perceived productivity improvement and increased work satisfaction. And or corporate developers with old code bases and very, very similar results on the perceived productivity improvement and also work satisfaction. Not very objective, right? They felt that they were more productive. How do you measure developer productivity? Codes of line? Who thinks that is a good idea? Come on. No? Nobody? Jira tasks closed? No? Anybody? So there are a lot of problems with objectively measuring developer productivity because all of these kinds of measures are very easily gameable, right? It's, codes of line, you just generate a lot of codes of line or write actually very bad code. So clearly not a good way of measuring. And it's not something like, sales, where you can just have one number and say, okay, that is a good worker and that is a bad worker. So GitHub research, or rather Microsoft research, came back and did a new kind of research project on developer experience, where here we understand with developer experience about how developers feel about, think, and value their work, and how that correlates with how successful an organization is, right? Or teams are. So this is a very, very new publication. It came out January 14 this year. As you see, it was done by Microsoft Research, mostly GitHub and University of Victoria. You can look it up. It's actually a very interesting read. There's a lot of more information than I can give today. They based their research on work design theory. And basically, in a kind of nutshell, it says that individual work and the tasks that people perform, it affects not only your, like as an individual, but also, of course, team and organization, but in different ways. So the developer outcomes that are impacted by certain changes in the work or processes for an individual, for the developer, impact work, performance, creativity, and learning. At a team level, code quality and technical depth. And then at organizational level, like retention, innovation, profitability, and ability to meet goals. And these are all things that can be, measured in different ways. And these are the developer experience dimensions that I try to correlate with the outcomes of these three groups that I showed earlier, right? So they were looking at developer perceived like flow state. That was in the first research, right? How often you can do this focused work, entering flow state that increases your productivity, but also increases your feeling of that you are satisfied with what you are doing, and you get at the end like, yes, I finished something and I feel good. Feedback loops that are more about, hey, how quickly you can get feedback on the fact that you finished some work, how quickly do you get feedback that it is actually working or good, and this could have like it could be tooling, right? How does your CI/CD pipeline look like? How quickly do you get feedback from your unit tests, from your integration tests, from performance, whatever suits, or human feedback? How quickly do you get comments or approvals on your pull requests? And then the cognitive load is basically the complexity of your code base, is complexity of your whole system. How well can you understand? How good do you know? How easily can you access and find information that you need to do your job? And so they made this model where they basically made some hypotheses, right? So these are the three different developer experience aspects that they were going to measure and look at. So the flow state, feedback loops, and cognitive load. And they wanted to look how each of these impact the outcomes for developers, for teams, and for organizations. And the hypothesis being that all of the developer experience aspects have some impact on the outcomes, but they wanted to figure out if that is true and if by how much. So they developed, based on good practices and of the work design theory and previous research surveys that they run. There were like, I think, about 300 developers. And the results were basically that. It's not particularly easy to read. But so all the solid lines means that there is statistically significant correlation between these things. So flow state correlates with developer outcomes, with team level outcomes, and org level outcomes, as does cognitive load. At different levels, like, so for example, cognitive load correlates more with team level outcomes and org level outcomes than with developer outcomes. So it's more important for collaboration than for your individual performance, while flow state is more important for developer outcomes than for organization outcomes, right? The interesting thing is that feedback loops, however, correlated only with team level outcomes, not with developer or organization outcomes. So yeah, I guess the takeaway from this is that with some thinking about how to correctly present, and maybe there's some specific information from that research that could be relevant to your organization, this can be taken and you can go back to your management or to people who buy you tools and say, hey, this tool, GitHub Copilot, is actually good for these kinds of things. You know, I cannot promise that I will write more code, more lines of code. However, it's very likely that I will be happier as a developer and I will be able to focus more. And that is good for the organization. Microsoft research proved it, okay? Like, yay. So yeah, so organizations, they were also doing like controlled variables, comparing or seeing if there's any difference in these things between organization size, like less than 500 or larger than 500, and also whether the industry is specifically tech or non-tech, and did not find any significant impact on these outcomes. So should be valid for all of your organizations, whether you work at a startup or at a company that has few 100,000 employees. Thank you. Any questions?
Are you using this Copilot by yourself?
Yes.
Do you like it?
Yes.
So regarding Copilot, this is purely for a Copilot as the code completion, yes? The research?
Yeah. Yes, so GitHub Copilot actually relatively recently, maybe 2 months ago, also introduced GitHub Copilot Chat, which is more like ChatGPT, slightly nerfed, but in Visual Studio Code, so you don't have to switch over to ask for free-form questions, but then you can also like talk to it, right? The same as you would do with ChatGPT or something like Bard or whatever. But it's mostly, it's in IDE code completion, either based on context alone or based on a prompt that you write in like comment or something.
I'm not sure where exactly is the code base located, but I know that in the previous company where we worked, we had early access for Copilot pull requests that also help basically provide suggestions to pull requests, how it will create descriptions, some possible suggestions to improve the code. Have you had a chance to try it out within your company and observe it?
Not pull requests. I think one of the latest additions that I noticed was that it was, you could just press a button and it would generate a commit message based on the changes. That is pretty good, I have to say. But in a lot of cases, it's more comprehensive than I would have written, because I tend to write like one line, and it's like, unless it's like really big change. I know that there are companies that provide this kind of additional like smart pull request bot or reviewers like some Code Rabbit or something like that I looked into, but I haven't used it personally.
And how good was the experience, for example, using the workspace option to, for example, when you ask the prompt and it checks out the code that is within your code base, how what was the experience for the developers using it?
Yeah.
What was observed?
We run it, this pilot was run before that feature was introduced. We ran it in September to October, I think, and it was added to where we could use in like November or something. So they didn't have that, and also the experience at that time was very different between like front-end or I don't know, Python developers, basically people who use Visual Studio Code versus people who use some JetBrains like IntelliJ, the Java developers. Because the IntelliJ plugin did not have the chat function, and that actually added a lot to the experience. Because then you really, you get the in-context suggestion, but if you need to ask something more complicated, right, or to give it some kind of data structure that is from somewhere else, then to help you generate something, then you have to go to some ChatGPT kind of thing, and you couldn't do it within and then have a conversation in the code base or in the IDE. And the Java developers were not happy. It was like, well, sorry, NetBrains hasn't released the plugin or whatever, like who of them is developing. But that is now, I think in December, they also released the chat for IntelliJ. So in this case, it all develops so quickly, right, that it is quite hard to stay on top of it. But at the same time, a lot of the functionality is basically improved like behind the scenes, right? So you just continue using and it kind of gets better. What is definitely I have noticed, and the developers as well noticed, is that you as you use it, right, you can make it adapt to your coding style, and then like the quality of suggestions very much also depends on how good your code base, like how good your in general is. If your code base has functions foo, bar, and zaz and variables ABC, then the Copilot is very unlikely being able to suggest something useful, right? If you have like proper naming structures, conventions, and then you start writing a new method that is like, I don't know, update customer address, and it already sees the previous, it sees what the data structures are, it sees how you are like conventionally handling errors, if you have some additional, like usually logging and things like that, and it will already generate similar to what you are using, not some very like super generic way. And you can teach it to, okay, I didn't like this suggestion, this has no error checking, right? And you force it to do it with error checking, and next time it already will suggest you the way you want it, right? So, yeah. No.
No doubt.
I can hear you, yes.
But I would like this to be recorded, right? Is that great? Maybe. One. Let me do this.
Just ignoring you.
This way? Just talk. Just what? Okay, I'll talk. I'll be a nasty guy that cares about security, in reality not, but speaking of the Accenture, I believe you have like lots and lots of clients.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle the fact that you're using Copilot in the real projects in terms of legal? Because I believe that many companies don't really want their code to be exposed to any kind of thing.
Well, we make explicit agreement with the client, and then the client signs off, yes, you can use Copilot. And if you are stuck in a project that the client doesn't agree, then it's well. But so these kinds of, I mean, okay, maybe not specifically this presentation, but in general, that is how we go to the clients and convince them that it is a good idea. Because of course, from our side, like we are trying to say, like, hey, this is really cool, right? But then the developers are like, okay, I want to use it. And it was like, well, sorry. So it's not good. Yeah, but you are absolutely right. It is an issue in a lot of industries, but sometimes it's not really so much about the industry as about the specific company and their legal or HR or whoever. I was like, yeah, no, we don't need that.
Do you have any specific percentage of like number of companies that agree on this? Because that's interesting. How it's moving.
No, I don't have that. We started gathering this data, but it's also probably not something we can share.
How you can control developers using or not using?
Well, I mean, it's the same as how can you control that the developer is not taking the code and just selling it on a street corner? It is specifically in the employment contract that you have to follow internal guidelines and rules and everything, including security guidelines and things like that. And specifically, using these kinds of tools, it depends on a project whether you are allowed to use it or not. So no, we cannot, we do not install like cameras in developers' homes and checking if they are using GitHub Copilot because it's not really.
Security policies or something. I was asking about it.
Yeah, but I mean, it's yeah.
Let's go on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you. I will have a non-technical question. I actually a little bit more interested in the survey you made. First of all, I wanted to clarify, I understood correctly, the survey was done in Accenture for Accenture employees, basically the auditory. And could you say for a little bit more words how you conducted that survey? It was some kind of interviews or it was questionnaire, something like that. Yeah, thank you.
So this was a specific pilot project, one project about 80 developers in about 10 teams, and we did a kind of guided and controlled introduction to GitHub Copilot. The team leads were responsible for the fact that they actually install the tool and enable it and try to use it, because technically the tool was available to them for a while, but the people just haven't bothered doing it. And so first of all, it was kind of change management. Hey, yes, here is how you enable it. Here is how you use it. Here is we run specific like use cases and showing them, hey, it works also in your enterprise Java code, and here are some examples how it can be helpful. And then after this introductory session, we run every sprint, like every 2 weeks, we run feedback sessions with them, kind of checking in. How are you doing? What have you found works for you? What have you found? What use cases doesn't work for you? There were some people who were very unhappy that it wouldn't generate some code for the Kafka queue processing, and it's like, well, I'm sorry. It's like, okay, right? But there were a lot of people who were super excited because it's like, oh, it helps me, write some basic unit tests, like the first part of it, and then I can just add more business logic, but the basic cases are covered. There were a lot of more junior developers who were very excited. There is an option that explains code, or like when they are onboarding into a new code base, where they get explanation of some weird functionality there. So these, and then we kind of share this information for some use cases, I looked up what can be done to improve the experience. We also looked like, well, hey, here are the use cases, right? That this tool is not going to work. You need to use something else. And then after 2 months, at the end of the 2 months, we wrapped it up and sent out the survey to all of these people. The response rate was about like 50%. The interesting thing, and I genuinely have no idea why, because the survey was anonymous, right? To get more honest responses. There were like, I think 2 or 3 people who answered that they use GitHub Copilot once a week. And I'm like, how do you do that? It's like, it's a tool, is installed and enabled. How do you use it once a week? It's like, do you come to work and like go and then sit down? It's like, okay, today I'm not using spell checker reward, so I turn it off because it's Monday. And on Tuesday, you're like, I'm turning off GitHub Copilot. But my guess is that they were maybe like a very senior developers or who don't actually get to code more than once a week because the rest of the time they spend in design and architecture meetings. Right? But that was very funny to me because and we were all looking at the data. It's like, what? How does it work? Any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, were there any cases when people were using the suggestions of Copilot, but then it looked good, for example, and then they implemented and happened it just doesn't work as expected?
Yeah, of course. That is programming. That doesn't need to be like Gen AI.
Yeah, but maybe I'm talking not about just doesn't work as expected, that it was really something that maybe looked good for a person who didn't have a lot of experience with that language, but it really was something absurd for that language that Copilot had suggested.
I didn't get feedback about anything absurd, right? There were some comments from like more senior people who were talking about when they were some very complicated, like more complicated logic, that they were like, oh, the solution looked good, but it had like this one really small bug for like very specific edge case that was hard to find. But I didn't hear that like anything about like so that was fully bad for like fully wrong. And of course that also depends like how your work is set up. Like if it was a case, then the hopefully at the time of a PR, someone would take a look and it's like, what is this, right? And it wouldn't get through. And one of the, I didn't put there all the data that was in a survey, but one of the things, I think I put it at the end. Right, so this was a demographic that we had 0, like so some juniors, some seniors, and for the benefits, do I have? Oh yeah, so this one, so decrease of defects is really hard to measure in such a short time, right? Because you usually will find the bugs much later, so it's kind of not. But this was, the reported decrease of defects was by the team leads, by the most senior people in the teams that are also surveyed a bit separately. Yeah.
No. But I have maybe one more question. So since especially you mentioned that for some projects, well, when client doesn't agree, this Copilot cannot be used, have you measured dissatisfaction when person who used Copilot, now they are put on project where they cannot use it and they start, I don't know, going mad and dissatisfied?
we haven't, because this was recently when we started. We like, okay, we should push it out more and go to talk to the clients and then convince them. And people don't change projects that often. But that is definitely a fear, right? Because that is not something we can directly influence if the client is in very super regulated industry and they are like, no, we are for sure not doing that. There are, however, of course, options, because there are, I mean, GitHub Copilot is, the state of the art in a way in this field. There are self-hosted options that provide somewhat similar experiences. I don't think the chat, but some. So there are options that we can, suggest to these types of clients. And then, of course, if there is a person who is already with that kind of experience, it's also, a way to convince, like, hey, it's really worth it, right? Hopefully we will not have a lot of such cases where we need to worry about.